Hellboy 2004, complete movie overview, plot, cast, and release details. Overview. Hellboy is a 2004 American superhero film based on the Dark Horse Comics character created by Mike Mignola. The movie was written and directed by acclaimed Mexican filmmaker Guillermo del Toro, a director celebrated for blending gothic horror with fantastical storytelling. Hellboy was produced through a partnership between Revolution Studios and Lawrence Gordon Productions, with financial and creative backing that allowed Del Toro to bring his distinct visual style to the screen. The film was distributed by Columbia Pictures under Sony Pictures, and it was filmed primarily in Prague, Czech Republic, a location that gave the movie its dark, atmospheric, and old-world aesthetic. Hellboy stands as one of the earlier examples of a modern comic book film that leaned heavily into practical effects, elaborate makeup, and gothic production design rather than relying purely on computer-generated imagery, which set it apart from many of its contemporaries in the early 2000s superhero film boom. The film introduced global audiences to a demon raised by humans who chooses to fight for the very world that fears him, a premise that gave the story emotional weight beyond typical action spectacle. Guillermo del Toro's passion for the source material was evident throughout production, as he insisted on practical prosthetics for the title character and worked closely with makeup artists to ensure Hellboy felt like a living, breathing being rather than a computer-generated creation. This dedication to craftsmanship became one of the defining qualities that separated Hellboy from other comic book adaptations of its era and helped it earn a devoted cult following that has only grown over the years. Plot details. The story of Hellboy begins in the final days of the Second World War, in the year 1944, when Nazi occultists working under the direction of the mad monk Grigory Rasputin attempt to open a portal to another dimension using dark magic. Their goal is to unleash the B.P.R.D, ancient and destructive entities referred to as the Seven Gods of Chaos, in order to turn the tide of the war in favor of the Axis powers. American and British forces intervene to stop the ritual before it can be completed, and in the chaos of the battle, a small portal briefly opens, allowing a strange infant creature to slip through into our world. This creature, red-skinned with filed-down horns and a stone right hand, is discovered by American soldiers and a young paranormal investigator named Trevor Bruttenholm. Rather than treating the creature as a threat, Bruttenholm takes him in, names him Hellboy, and raises him within a secretive American government organization known as the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense. Decades later, Hellboy has grown into a towering, wisecracking, cigar-smoking demon who works as the Bureau's most powerful field agent, using his immense strength and a specially modified oversized revolver to battle supernatural threats that ordinary humans cannot handle. He works alongside Abe Sapien, an amphibious psychic being with extraordinary intelligence, and Liz Sherman, a young woman with the ability to generate and control fire, a power she struggles to control due to the trauma it caused in her past. The story follows a new FBI agent named John Myers, who is assigned to the Bureau and becomes the audience's window into this hidden world of monsters and government secrecy. As Myers adjusts to his new role, he becomes personally connected to both Hellboy and Liz, forming a bond that adds emotional complexity to the unfolding events. The central conflict of the film reignites when Rasputin, who did not die during the failed 1944 ritual but instead exists in a state between life and death, returns to finish what he started 6 decades earlier. Working alongside Cronin, a nearly indestructible Nazi assassin who has kept himself alive through mechanical modification, and a fire elemental hound named Samuel capable of regenerating and multiplying whenever it is wounded, Rasputin sets his plan into motion once again. His ultimate goal is to open the dimensional gate fully and unleash the B.P.R.D to bring about the end of the world as humanity knows it. Hellboy and his allies must confront Samuel's relentless assault across the city, protect Liz Sherman from Rasputin's manipulation, and ultimately stop the full opening of the portal before it consumes everything. As the story builds toward its climax, Hellboy is forced to confront deep questions about his own identity and destiny. Ancient prophecy suggests that Hellboy himself was meant to serve as the key to unleashing the B.P.R.D, and Rasputin attempts to use this destiny against him, tempting Hellboy to embrace his demonic nature and abandon humanity altogether. The emotional core of the film rests on Hellboy's choice between the darkness he was born into and the human world that raised him and gave him purpose. Bruttenholm, his adoptive father figure, plays a critical role in reminding Hellboy of the values he was raised with, even as tragedy strikes during the final confrontation. In the end, Hellboy rejects the destructive path laid out for him, standing firmly with humanity and the people he loves, and battles to close the portal and defeat Rasputin's forces once and for all. The film closes with Hellboy solidifying his place as Earth's unlikely protector, choosing love and loyalty over the destiny that was written for him before he was even born. Cast: Ron Perlman stars as Hellboy, delivering a performance widely regarded as definitive for the character, combining gruff humor with surprising vulnerability beneath layers of prosthetic makeup. Selma Blair plays Liz Sherman, portraying the emotional struggle of a woman who fears her own destructive power while trying to find stability and connection. Rupert Evans takes on the role of John Myers, the newly recruited agent whose perspective helps guide audiences through the hidden world of the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense. Legendary actor John Hurt portrays Trevor Bruttenholm, the scientist and father figure who raised Hellboy and shaped his moral compass. Carell Roden plays the villainous Grigory Rasputin, bringing a chilling and theatrical menace to the role of the resurrected mystic seeking to bring about the apocalypse. Jeffrey Tambor appears as Tom Manning, the Bureau's often exasperated human director who must manage Hellboy's unconventional methods while keeping his existence hidden from the public. Doug Jones performs the physical role of Abe Sapien, the empathetic and highly intelligent aquatic being, with the character's voice provided by David Hyde Pierce. Ladislav Baron portrays Cronin, the silent and terrifying mechanical assassin whose presence adds a distinct horror element to the film. Together, this ensemble cast brought Mike Mignola's richly detailed comic book world to life with performances that balanced dark fantasy, heartfelt drama, and dry humor in a way that felt fresh for its time. Release date: Hellboy was released theatrically in the United States on April 2, 2004, distributed by Columbia Pictures. The film arrived during a period when comic book adaptations were beginning to gain significant momentum in Hollywood, though Hellboy carved its own unique space thanks to Guillermo del Toro's distinctive gothic vision and the film's willingness to embrace practical creature effects over a more conventional superhero blockbuster approach. While it performed respectably at the box office rather than becoming an enormous financial phenomenon, Hellboy went on to build a passionate and lasting fanbase, eventually leading to a sequel, Hellboy 2: The Golden Army, released in 2008, and cementing its place as one of the most beloved comic book films of its era among fans and critics alike. Hellboy: The Complete Story Retelling. The rain over the Scottish coast fell in cold, unrelenting sheets on the night of October 9, 1944, hammering against the ruins of an ancient stone abbey perched on a windswept cliff above the churning sea. Inside those crumbling walls, a very different storm was gathering, one born not of nature but of something far older and far darker than the war that raged across the rest of the world. Nazi soldiers moved through the abbey's shattered corridors with mechanical discipline, setting up strange brass instruments and cables that hummed faintly with unnatural energy, while at the center of it all stood a man who did not belong to any army, though he wore no uniform of his own either. His name was Grigory Rasputin, and though history books would later claim he died decades earlier in the freezing waters of a Russian river, death had never quite managed to hold him. He stood before a massive iron archway carved with symbols no living scholar could fully translate, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond it as though he could already see through to the other side. Rasputin had spent years convincing the Nazi high command that the war could be won not through tanks and soldiers but through forces older than mankind itself. He had promised them access to beings of unimaginable power, entities he called the B.P.R.D, the seven gods of chaos, ancient creatures bound outside of reality itself, sealed away before the dawn of human civilization. If the gateway could be opened fully, he told them, these beings would tear through the fabric of the world and reshape it in the image of the Reich, or perhaps in an image far worse than anyone in that room could imagine. Whether the Nazi officers believed him out of desperation or fanaticism hardly mattered anymore. The machine was built. The ritual was ready. And Rasputin intended to use it that very night. Unbeknownst to the men inside the abbey, a joint force of American and British soldiers had been tracking the strange occult activity for weeks, following whispers of glowing lights on the cliffside and reports of livestock found drained and lifeless in nearby villages. Local farmers had spoken in hushed, frightened tones of strange chanting carried on the wind at night, of crops withering overnight in fields nearest the ruin, of a creeping dread that seemed to settle over the surrounding countryside the closer one drew to the abbey's broken walls. Intelligence officers had dismissed these reports for months as wartime superstition until mounting evidence of genuine, unexplainable occult activity finally forced a joint task force to be assembled and dispatched under cover of the storm. Among the soldiers creeping toward the abbey through the storm was a young American academic named Professor Trevor Bruttenholm, a paranormal researcher who had been quietly recruited by the United States government to investigate the growing intersection between the war and the world of the supernatural. Bruttenholm was no soldier. He carried a notebook instead of a proper weapon, his coat pockets stuffed with pencils, small vials, and hand-drawn diagrams of occult symbols he had spent years studying in university archives that few of his academic peers took seriously. His superiors had assigned him to the mission reluctantly, more interested in his ability to identify and catalog whatever strange artifacts the raid might uncover than in any real expectation that his expertise would prove useful in combat. His eyes held more curiosity than fear as the assault team breached the outer walls of the abbey and began fighting their way inside, moving through smoke-filled corridors lit only by the flickering glow of emergency flares and the strange, sickly light emanating from somewhere deep within the ruin's heart. The battle that followed was chaotic and strange, gunfire mixing with the eerie chanting of Rasputin's cultists as the soldiers pushed deeper into the ruin. Rasputin, sensing the ritual was in danger of being interrupted before completion, urged his followers to accelerate the process, channeling the last of the required energy into the archway. The iron gate began to glow with a sickly greenish light, cracks of pure darkness splitting open across its surface as something on the other side pressed forward, eager to be born into the world. Soldiers fired uselessly at the widening portal, unable to comprehend what they were looking at. Just as the tear between worlds threatened to fully open, an American demolitions officer managed to plant explosive charges at the base of the archway's support structure, and with a final desperate command, the charges were detonated. The explosion tore through the ritual chamber, collapsing sections of the ancient stone ceiling and severing the flow of energy into the gateway before the passage could be completed. Rasputin himself was caught in the blast, his body seemingly destroyed, though something about the way the darkness recoiled into itself suggested this would not be the end of him. In the smoke and rubble left behind, soldiers began searching for survivors and evidence of what exactly they had just witnessed. It was Bruttenholm who noticed something moving beneath a pile of broken stone near where the portal had briefly gaped open, a small shape no larger than a house cat, red-skinned, with two tiny stone horns filed down to nubs and a peculiar oversized right hand made of what looked like solid rock. The creature blinked up at the soldiers with wide, startled eyes, utterly harmless despite its bizarre appearance, and let out a small, confused sound that was somehow more curious than menacing. Soldiers immediately wanted to destroy the thing, certain that anything that had crawled through from the other side of that gate could only be a herald of the horrors Rasputin had promised. But Bruttenholm, ever the scientist and never a man ruled by fear, stepped between the creature and the soldiers' weapons. He knelt down, extended a hand, and to everyone's astonishment, the small red creature reached out and took it, allowing itself to be picked up and carried away from the ruins of the abbey. Bruttenholm decided, almost on instinct, to give the creature a name, something simple and almost affectionately mocking given its infernal appearance. He called it Hellboy. It was a name meant half in jest, yet it would come to define the creature's entire existence, shaping the very war between destiny and choice that would follow him for the rest of his life. In the years that followed, Bruttenholm took it upon himself to raise Hellboy not as a specimen to be studied and contained, but as something closer to a son. The United States government, recognizing the immense potential and equally immense danger the creature represented, established a secretive organization known as the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense, tasking it with investigating and neutralizing supernatural threats that conventional forces could never hope to handle. Hellboy grew up within the walls of this hidden agency, raised alongside other extraordinary beings the Bureau had taken in over the decades, learning to control his immense strength, his volatile temper, and the enormous stone hand that seemed to carry with it a weight far heavier than mere rock. Bruttenholm taught him what it meant to have a conscience, what it meant to choose kindness even when the whole world might expect monstrosity from something that looked the way he did. By the time Hellboy reached adulthood, though he stood well over 7 feet tall with crimson skin, a long tail he kept wrapped around his waist beneath oversized coats, and horns he insisted on filing down out of habit rather than necessity, he had become something far more human in spirit than most of the people who would one day fear him on sight. The years between that stormy night and the present day were not idle ones for Bruttenholm, or for the strange creature he had chosen to raise as his own. As Hellboy grew from a curious, wide-eyed infant into an increasingly powerful and headstrong young being, Bruttenholm found himself walking a delicate line between scientific curiosity and genuine paternal devotion. He kept detailed journals chronicling Hellboy's growth, his moods, his strength, and the slow, sometimes painful process of teaching a creature born of fire and darkness what it meant to have empathy, patience, and restraint. There were difficult years, moments when Hellboy's temper flared dangerously and the very walls of the facility that housed him bore the scars of his frustration, and there were tender years too, quiet evenings where Bruttenholm read to him from books on history and folklore, teaching him not what he was but who he could choose to become. It was during these formative years that Hellboy developed the gruff, sarcastic sense of humor that would later define him, a defense mechanism as much as a genuine personality trait, built to shield a deeply lonely creature from a world that could never quite decide whether to fear him or study him. 60 years after that stormy night on the Scottish coast, the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense operated out of a concealed underground facility beneath the city, its existence known only to a handful of government officials and the agents who worked within its walls. The facility itself was a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors, reinforced containment chambers, and archives filled with centuries of collected occult knowledge, relics, and case files documenting encounters with beings that most of the world would dismiss as myth or superstition. Deep within this hidden complex, Hellboy had carved out something resembling a home, his personal quarters cluttered with stacks of pulp comic books, cat food tins for the dozens of stray cats he had adopted over the years, and hand-carved figurines he sculpted in his rare moments of quiet solitude. It was a strange, almost domestic existence for a being of his power, and it was precisely that contradiction, the monster who collected kittens and read comic books, that made him so compelling to everyone who eventually came to know him. Hellboy had become the Bureau's most formidable field operative, a demon who smoked cheap cigars, filed down his horns each morning out of pure habit, and carried a massive customized revolver capable of firing rounds specifically designed to deal with occult and supernatural threats. Despite his monstrous strength, Hellboy possessed a sharp wit and a stubborn, almost childlike defiance of authority, clashing constantly with the Bureau's exasperated human director, Tom Manning, who found himself perpetually torn between needing Hellboy's unmatched abilities and despising the property damage and public exposure risk that came with every mission Hellboy undertook. At Hellboy's side worked Abe Sapien, an amphibious being of extraordinary intelligence and calm, empathetic wisdom, capable of psychically reading impressions left on objects and people simply through touch. Abe lived within a specially designed containment tank filled with a nutrient-rich fluid that sustained him, venturing out through corridors and field missions in a specialized suit that allowed him to breathe outside water for extended periods. Unlike Hellboy's brash impulsiveness, Abe approached every situation with careful, analytical patience, often serving as the voice of reason whenever Hellboy's temper threatened to spiral out of control. The Bureau's newest and most tragic addition was a young woman named Liz Sherman, who had been brought into the organization as a child after a horrifying incident revealed she possessed the terrifying ability to generate and control fire, a power so unstable in her youth that it had resulted in the deaths of members of her own family during an accident she had never fully forgiven herself for. Liz had spent years struggling to control her abilities, oscillating between periods of calm stability and moments where the fire within her threatened to consume everything around her, including herself. She and Hellboy shared a deep, complicated bond forged over years of working together, a friendship tinged with an unspoken romantic tension that neither of them seemed entirely willing to confront directly, though everyone else within the Bureau could see it plainly. On an unusually cold winter morning, a young FBI agent named John Myers arrived at the Bureau's underground headquarters, freshly assigned to serve as its new liaison after his predecessor's retirement. Myers had spent years building a reputation as a diligent, level-headed agent within the Bureau, someone who followed protocol and rarely questioned orders, which made his sudden reassignment to an organization he had barely heard whispered about in classified briefings all the more disorienting. He arrived expecting a standard administrative post, perhaps a desk buried somewhere in a forgotten government building, and instead found himself standing before an elevator that descended for what felt like an impossibly long time, deep beneath the surface of the city, into a world he could scarcely have imagined existed. Myers was young, principled, and entirely unprepared for what awaited him inside those hidden corridors. His first encounter with Hellboy left him stunned into silence, the massive red demon casually filing his horns down at a bathroom mirror while grumbling about paperwork, as though he were any ordinary employee annoyed by bureaucracy rather than an actual creature from another dimension. Hellboy barely glanced at him, offering only a dry, unimpressed remark about yet another agent being sent to keep an eye on him, before returning to his grooming with the bored indifference of someone who had greeted dozens of nervous new liaisons before and expected this one to last no longer than the others. Myers was quickly introduced to Abe Sapien, whose eerie, calm intelligence unsettled him almost as much as Hellboy's brute physicality. Abe, floating serenely within his containment tank, greeted Myers with startling politeness, effortlessly reciting details about Myers's own life that he could only have known through some form of psychic impression, a demonstration that left the young agent both fascinated and thoroughly rattled. It did not take long before Manning made it clear, in blunt and somewhat resentful terms, that Myers's primary responsibility would be to serve as Hellboy's field liaison and, less officially, as a kind of babysitter meant to keep the temperamental demon from causing an international incident every time he was sent out on assignment. Myers's introduction to fieldwork came swiftly and violently. Deep beneath a natural history museum in the city, an ancient tomb sealed for centuries had been disturbed, and reports of strange, animalistic sounds echoing through the museum's lower levels prompted the Bureau to dispatch its team immediately. Hellboy, Abe, and the newly assigned Myers descended into the museum's underground chambers, discovering with growing dread that a creature had somehow been summoned into the sealed tomb, a massive, hound-like beast composed of living flame and tentacled flesh, its body wrapped in ancient bandages and chains that seemed to bind some elemental fury within it. This creature, known as Samel, the Hound of Resurrection, attacked with savage, relentless force, and Hellboy found himself locked in brutal combat against something unlike anything he had faced before. What made Samel truly terrifying was not merely its raw strength but its horrifying regenerative ability. Every time Hellboy managed to wound or even kill one of the creatures, its body would burst apart and immediately birth two new, smaller versions of itself, each one just as vicious and just as capable of multiplying further if struck down carelessly. Abe, analyzing the situation with characteristic composure even as chaos erupted around them, quickly deduced that the creatures could only be permanently destroyed through very specific, precise strikes rather than brute force alone, a realization that came only after several tense minutes of watching their enemies' numbers multiply rather than shrink with every blow Hellboy landed. The battle beneath the museum grew increasingly desperate as more and more of the creatures spawned from the wreckage of their predecessors, forcing Hellboy, Abe, and a terrified but determined Myers to retreat upward through the museum's exhibit halls while the beasts tore through priceless artifacts and display cases in pursuit. It was during this chaotic retreat that Myers witnessed firsthand the strange, almost comedic domesticity buried beneath Hellboy's monstrous exterior, watching him casually toss aside destroyed exhibits while muttering complaints about Manning's inevitable anger over the property damage, even as he fought for his life against creatures born from myth and nightmare. At one point, cornered in a hall lined with ancient sarcophagi, Hellboy shoved Myers behind a display case for protection with startling gentleness, a small but telling gesture that revealed far more about his true nature than his gruff exterior ever could. Myers, gun drawn and hands trembling, found himself firing uselessly at creatures that shrugged off ordinary bullets as though they were raindrops, and it was only Hellboy's specially modified revolver, loaded with rounds designed specifically to counter supernatural threats, that finally began turning the tide of the battle. By the time the last of the creatures was destroyed for good, the museum's lower halls lay in ruins, priceless artifacts reduced to rubble, and Myers stood breathless and shaken, beginning to understand the true scope of the world he had just been thrust into. Eventually, with the museum badly damaged and several of the creatures finally destroyed for good after Hellboy learned to strike killing blows precisely enough to prevent their regeneration, the immediate threat was contained, though not without consequence. News crews and bystanders had gathered outside the museum during the chaos, and despite the Bureau's best efforts to maintain secrecy, images of Hellboy emerging from the wreckage began to leak into public awareness, deepening the tension between Hellboy's usefulness to the government and the very real danger his exposure posed to the delicate balance the Bureau had maintained for decades. Manning was furious, storming through the underground facility demanding to know how such a public exposure could have been allowed to happen, while Bruttenholm, now an elderly man but still serving as Hellboy's guiding mentor and father figure within the Bureau, urged calm and patience, reminding Manning that no containment strategy could ever fully account for the unpredictable nature of the threats they faced. Hellboy himself brushed off the criticism with characteristic sarcasm, more concerned in that moment with finding an excuse to see Liz Sherman, who had been placed under psychiatric observation at a private clinic after a recent incident involving her fire abilities had left her shaken and questioning whether she was truly safe to be around other people at all. Liz's history within the Bureau stretched back to her childhood, when a devastating accident involving her uncontrolled pyrokinetic abilities had resulted in the deaths of members of her own family, a tragedy that had left her convinced, for most of her life, that she was fundamentally dangerous to anyone who dared to get close to her. The Bureau had taken her in as a child, recognizing both the threat and the potential her abilities represented, and over the years she had cycled repeatedly between periods of relative stability and moments where the sheer emotional weight of her past overwhelmed her control, forcing her into voluntary confinement at private psychiatric facilities where she hoped isolation might protect the people around her from the fire she carried within herself. Hellboy had visited her at these facilities more times than either of them cared to admit, sneaking away from the Bureau's secrecy protocols to sit outside her window or slip notes beneath her door, a quiet, persistent devotion that Liz had never quite allowed herself to fully accept, fearing that any closeness between them would only end in the same kind of tragedy that haunted her past. While the Bureau grappled with the aftermath of the museum attack, the true architect behind the chaos was quietly reassembling his forces in the shadows. Rasputin, it turned out, had never truly died in that Scottish ruin 60 years earlier. Bound to a strange, undying existence through his own occult mastery, sustained across the decades within a realm suspended between life and death, He had spent the years since patiently rebuilding his strength, gathering fragments of forgotten knowledge, and waiting for the precise alignment of circumstance that would finally allow him to complete the ritual that had been so violently interrupted. His resurrection into the physical world once again was itself a small miracle of dark sorcery, achieved through the devotion of his most loyal followers, who had spent generations passing down the sacred task of one day restoring him fully to power. At his side remained Cronin, a Nazi assassin from the original ritual who had modified his own body through brutal mechanical augmentation to defy death itself, his face nothing more than a stitched leather mask concealing rotted, preserved flesh beneath, his movements eerily precise and utterly silent as he carried out Rasputin's will without hesitation or emotion. Cronin's loyalty to Rasputin bordered on religious devotion, a soldier who had long ago traded his own humanity for the promise of serving a cause he believed would reshape the world entirely. Alongside them worked a woman named Ilsa, a fiercely loyal follower whose devotion to Rasputin's cause seemed to stem from something between fanatical belief and genuine affection, though her true motivations remained largely her own secret. Ilsa carried herself with cold, disciplined precision, coordinating the logistics of Rasputin's growing scheme while harboring a quiet, complicated bond with Cronin that neither of them ever openly acknowledged. Together, this trio began orchestrating a new plan, one designed not merely to reopen the portal from 60 years prior but to use Hellboy himself as the key that would finally allow the B.P.R.D to cross fully into the world. Rasputin understood something that the Bureau itself had never fully explained to Hellboy, a truth buried deep within ancient prophecy that spoke of a being born of both fire and destiny, destined to either save the world or become the very instrument of its destruction. Hellboy, it turned out, was never meant to be merely rescued from that Scottish ritual. He had been deliberately summoned, shaped by forces beyond mortal comprehension to one day serve as the key capable of unlocking the seal that bound the B.P.R.D. Rasputin's new plan involved manipulating circumstances to push Hellboy toward embracing this destiny, using Liz Sherman's own fragile emotional state and uncontrollable power as a pawn in his broader scheme, believing that her fire, combined with Hellboy's true nature, could provide the final key needed to shatter the seal entirely. As Hellboy grew increasingly restless and frustrated by the Bureau's secrecy regarding his own origins and the strange prophecy hinted at in ancient texts kept within their archives, tensions within the organization began to rise. He had, over the years, caught fragments of conversations not meant for his ears, glimpsed old documents locked away in restricted sections of the Bureau's library, enough to suspect that Bruttenholm and Manning knew far more about his true nature than either of them had ever been willing to share with him directly. This growing suspicion gnawed at him quietly beneath his usual sarcasm and bravado, a private wound he rarely allowed anyone to see. Bruttenholm, though loving Hellboy as a true son, had spent decades deliberately withholding the full truth of what Hellboy might one day become, fearing that such knowledge could push him toward the very darkness the prophecy warned of, a fear rooted not in distrust of Hellboy's character but in a father's desperate hope to protect his child from a burden no one should ever have to carry. Myers, meanwhile, found himself growing closer to both Hellboy and Liz during this period, his genuine kindness and open-mindedness earning him a grudging respect from Hellboy even as an unspoken rivalry began to form between them over Liz's affections, a rivalry complicated further by Hellboy's own inability to openly express the depth of his feelings for her. Where Hellboy communicated affection through gruff sarcasm, stolen glances, and small acts of quiet devotion he rarely acknowledged aloud, Myers offered Liz something different, a straightforward, uncomplicated kindness free of the emotional baggage that years of trauma and secrecy had built up between Liz and Hellboy. Liz herself remained caught between the two, genuinely fond of Myers's easy warmth while unable to deny the far deeper, more complicated bond she shared with Hellboy, a tension that added a quiet undercurrent of heartache to the Bureau's already fraught atmosphere in the weeks leading up to Bruttenholm's death. The situation escalated dramatically when Cronin, acting on Rasputin's orders, infiltrated the Bureau's supposedly secure headquarters with terrifying ease, moving through the facility's corridors like a phantom, his mechanical body immune to the kind of pain or fear that might slow a normal assassin. Security systems that had guarded the Bureau's secrets for decades proved entirely useless against an enemy who did not breathe, did not register on any conventional sensor, and moved with a silence that bordered on the supernatural. Guards posted throughout the facility fell one by one without ever raising an alarm, their bodies discovered only after Cronin had already reached deep into the heart of the complex, moving unerringly toward his intended target as though guided by some dark and unerring instinct. Cronin's target was Bruttenholm himself, and despite the old professor's attempts to defend himself within the sanctuary of his private study, surrounded by decades of research and artifacts collected across a lifetime devoted to understanding the paranormal, he proved no match for the relentless killer. The confrontation was brief and one-sided, Bruttenholm's frail, aging body no match for an assassin who had traded his own mortality away decades earlier in service of a cause that refused to die. Hellboy arrived too late to save his mentor, rushing through the corridors the moment word reached him that something was wrong, only to find Bruttenholm mortally wounded amid the wreckage of his own study, surrounded by scattered papers and shattered glass from cabinets that had once held relics from a lifetime of extraordinary work. In his final moments, Bruttenholm finally revealed to Hellboy the full truth of the prophecy that had shaped his entire existence, his voice weak but steady as he spoke, choosing his words with the same careful precision he had used decades earlier when first deciding to give the strange red infant a name rather than a cage. He explained that Hellboy had been foretold to open the gateway that would unleash the Ardra Jihad upon the world, a destiny Bruttenholm had spent his entire life trying to help Hellboy avoid through love, guidance, and the simple, stubborn hope that choice could triumph over fate. He confessed that his silence on the matter had never been born of distrust, but of fear that knowledge of such a destiny might become a self-fulfilling prophecy if given voice too soon, fear that the boy he had raised as his own son might one day come to believe that darkness was the only path available to him. With his dying breath, Bruttenholm told Hellboy that despite everything, despite the darkness written into his very nature, he had always had the power to choose who he wanted to be, and that this power, more than any prophecy or bloodline, was the truest inheritance he could ever leave behind. The death of Bruttenholm sent Hellboy into a spiral of grief and simmering rage, his sense of loss compounded by the devastating revelation of his true destined purpose. For the first time in his life, Hellboy found himself questioning whether the humanity he had spent decades cultivating was simply a losing battle against a fate that had been written for him before he was even born, and in the days immediately following the funeral, he withdrew from nearly everyone around him, spending long, silent hours alone in his cluttered quarters surrounded by the comic books and carved figurines that had once brought him comfort, but now felt like relics of a simpler life that had ended the moment Cronin's blade found Bruttenholm's chest. Manning, in the chaos following Bruttenholm's death, made the difficult decision to elevate Hellboy's profile within the government's awareness, recognizing that hiding him away would do nothing to stop Rasputin's growing threat, and that continuing to treat his existence as a shameful secret would only weaken the Bureau's ability to respond effectively to whatever came next. It was a decision that cost Manning politically within the upper levels of government oversight, but one he made with surprising conviction, having come, despite years of frustration, to genuinely respect the strange, sarcastic creature who had spent decades protecting a world that rarely thanked him for it. Liz Sherman, upon hearing of Bruttenholm's death, checked herself out of the psychiatric facility against medical advice, determined to be there for Hellboy despite her own unresolved fears about her destructive power, understanding instinctively that whatever darkness threatened to consume him in his grief was not something he should be left to face alone. Rasputin, sensing the perfect opportunity presented by Hellboy's grief and vulnerability, orchestrated the kidnapping of Liz Sherman, using her as bait to lure Hellboy directly into his trap. He understood, with the patient cruelty of someone who had spent 6 decades studying his enemy, that grief made even the strongest hearts vulnerable to manipulation, and that Hellboy's devotion to Liz represented the single greatest weakness he could exploit in his pursuit of completing the ritual. Ilsa and Cronin captured Liz during a moment of heightened chaos within the Bureau, slipping past reduced security still reeling from Bruttenholm's assassination, and transported her to an ancient, ruined structure deep within a remote cemetery. A location chosen specifically because it sat atop the same kind of occult convergence point that had allowed the original 1944 ritual to briefly tear open the barrier between worlds. There, bound within the crumbling remains of a mausoleum built centuries before any of the players in this unfolding tragedy had been born, Rasputin began preparations for the final ritual, intending to use Liz's fire abilities in conjunction with Hellboy's true nature to fully shatter the seal and finally unleash the Agdra Jihad upon a defenseless world. He spoke to Liz throughout the preparations with an unsettling gentleness, attempting to convince her that her power was never meant to be feared or suppressed, that it belonged to something far greater than the small, fragile human life she had spent years trying to protect through isolation and restraint, a manipulation eerily similar to the one he intended to use against Hellboy himself once the demon arrived to rescue her. When Hellboy discovered Liz had been taken, his grief hardened into a cold, focused determination that even Manning and Abe found unsettling in its intensity. He said little as he prepared for the confrontation, methodically loading his revolver and checking his gear with a silence that spoke louder than any outburst of rage could have. Alongside Abe Sapien and John Myers, Hellboy tracked Rasputin's forces to the cemetery, a sprawling, fog-shrouded expanse of crumbling mausoleums and centuries-old headstones that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. The ancient structure at the heart of the cemetery, half collapsed and overgrown with dead ivy, radiated the same unnatural cold that Bruttenholm had once described in his old journals from that fateful night in Scotland decades earlier. The team fought through waves of Cronin's mechanical defenses and the ever-multiplying horde of Sammel's regenerated offspring, which Rasputin had unleashed to guard the ritual site, the creatures pouring out from behind headstones and crumbling crypts in numbers that seemed to grow no matter how many were destroyed. The battle that unfolded across the cemetery grounds was chaotic and brutal, Hellboy tearing through enemies with a ferocity born of both grief and desperation, using his stone hand to crush through stone monuments as easily as he crushed through the creatures themselves. Abe used his own considerable strength and psychic abilities to hold off Rasputin's occult defenses, deflecting bursts of dark energy while trying to shield Myers, who fought bravely despite being hopelessly outmatched by the supernatural forces surrounding him. Cronin himself eventually confronted Hellboy directly amid the chaos, the two trading devastating blows across the ruined cemetery grounds, Cronin's inhuman speed and precision proving a genuine match for Hellboy's raw strength until sheer brute force finally began to overwhelm the ancient assassin's mechanical body. At the heart of the ruined structure, Rasputin confronted Hellboy directly, revealing the full scope of his manipulation and mocking Hellboy's futile attempts to deny the destiny written into his very existence. He spoke with the calm, unhurried confidence of a man who had waited 60 years for this exact moment, circling Hellboy slowly amid the flickering candlelight and ancient carvings that lined the ritual chamber, each word calculated to chip away at whatever resolve grief had left intact. He explained that Hellboy's massive stone right hand, which Hellboy had always regarded as little more than an unusual physical trait, a curiosity he filed and hid beneath oversized gloves and coats, was in fact the literal key required to unlock the seal binding the Agdra Jihad, a fact Bruttenholm had kept hidden for Hellboy's entire life out of fear of exactly this moment. Rasputin attempted to goad Hellboy into using that hand to shatter the seal himself, promising him ultimate power and a place among the gods of chaos rather than servitude to a humanity that had only ever feared and used him, reminding him bitterly of every newspaper headline that had painted him as a monster, every terrified glance from strangers who saw only a demon rather than the man Bruttenholm had raised him to be. He painted a vision of a world remade in Hellboy's image, free of the secrecy and containment the Bureau had wrapped around his entire existence. A world where he would never again need to hide behind a mask of filed horns and human clothing. For a brief, terrible moment, standing amid the ruins with Liz Sherman bound and helpless before him, and grief still raw from the loss of the only father he had ever known, Hellboy seemed to waver, his hand trembling as he stared at the ancient seal glowing faintly before him, the weight of 6 decades of prophecy pressing down against 60 years of love and upbringing in a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. It was Liz who ultimately reached him, her voice cutting through the darkness, clouding his judgment, reminding him of everything Bruttenholm had taught him, reminding him that the choice had always been his to make regardless of what prophecy or destiny demanded. She spoke to him not as a captive pleading for rescue but as someone who understood, perhaps better than anyone else alive, exactly what it felt like to be defined by a power one never asked for, to spend a lifetime wondering whether destruction was simply written into one's blood beyond any hope of change. Her words carried the weight of shared experience rather than mere comfort, and it was precisely that shared understanding that finally broke through the fog of grief and temptation clouding Hellboy's mind. She reminded him, gently but firmly, that she herself had once believed her fire made her nothing more than a monster waiting to happen, and that he, more than anyone, had been the one to convince her otherwise across all their years together. In that moment, something in Hellboy shifted, the trembling in his massive stone hand finally stilling as clarity returned to his eyes. Rather than using his stone hand to shatter the seal and unleash the apocalypse Rasputin so desperately craved, Hellboy turned that same immense strength against Rasputin's ritual apparatus, smashing the mechanisms and structures that had been carefully arranged to complete the ceremony, ancient brass instruments and carved stone altars crumbling beneath blows fueled equally by fury and by newfound resolve. Enraged by this defiance, Rasputin attempted to force the ritual to completion through sheer occult will, tearing open a smaller but still catastrophic breach in reality, from which a horrifying, massive tentacled horror belonging to the Agdra Jihad began to emerge, threatening to finish what Rasputin had started regardless of Hellboy's refusal. As the creature began pulling itself through the widening breach, its massive tentacled form blotting out what little moonlight filtered into the ruined chamber, the temperature around the ritual site plummeting as though the very presence of the thing drained warmth from the world itself, it threatened to complete the apocalypse even without Hellboy's direct participation. It fell to Liz Sherman, finally freed from her restraints during the chaos of the collapsing ritual, to make her own choice about the power she had spent her entire life fearing and suppressing. She had spent years believing her fire was nothing more than a curse, a force that had taken her family from her and threatened to take everyone else she ever dared to love, and in this single, decisive moment, surrounded by the ruins of Rasputin's scheme and the man she loved fighting for his very soul beside her, she chose to see it differently. Rather than continuing to see her fire as a curse that had only ever brought destruction and death, Liz made the deliberate decision to fully unleash her abilities without restraint for the first time in her adult life, channeling raw, overwhelming flame directly into the emerging horror and the collapsing ritual site around it. The fire that erupted from her in that moment was unlike anything she had ever produced before, a controlled, purposeful inferno rather than the panicked, destructive bursts of her past, burning not out of fear or trauma but out of deliberate will. The resulting blaze was cataclysmic, consuming the emerging horror inch by inch as it screeched and thrashed against the widening breach, sealing the gateway shut and destroying the creature before it could fully cross into the world. The very power Liz had spent years running from ultimately became the thing that saved humanity from annihilation, a transformation as much personal as it was heroic. In the chaos of the collapsing ritual chamber, Rasputin himself was caught in the devastation, his ancient, undying form finally, truly destroyed as the collapsing stone structure crushed down around the shattered remains of his decades-long scheme, 6 decades of patient plotting undone in a matter of seconds. Cronin, similarly, met his end in brutal, close-quarters combat against Hellboy amid the collapsing ruins, his mechanical body finally failing him after 6 decades of unnatural existence, the assassin's silent, relentless menace extinguished at last beneath the sheer overwhelming force of Hellboy's grief-fueled fury. In the aftermath of the battle, As dawn broke over the smoking ruins of the cemetery, Hellboy carried an exhausted but alive Liz Sherman from the wreckage, the two of them finally, wordlessly acknowledging the connection that had existed between them for years but had always gone unspoken amid the chaos of their extraordinary lives. Neither of them needed to say very much in that moment, the quiet exhaustion between them carrying more honesty than any grand declaration could have offered, a silent understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together rather than from behind the careful emotional distance they had both maintained for so long. Myers, having proven himself far more capable and courageous than anyone, including himself, had initially believed, stood alongside Abe Sapien surveying the devastation, a quiet respect having formed between him and Hellboy despite their earlier rivalry, the shared trial of battle having stripped away whatever petty jealousy had once stood between them. Manning, arriving with additional Bureau personnel to manage the cleanup and inevitable cover story that would need to be constructed for the public, found himself grudgingly acknowledging that whatever chaos Hellboy brought with him, the world remained safer for his existence rather than in spite of it. Standing amid the wreckage of the cemetery, watching the exhausted team make their way back toward the waiting vehicles, Manning allowed himself, for perhaps the first time since taking charge of the Bureau, a rare moment of genuine gratitude rather than exasperation. Quietly resolving that the next chapter of the organization's work would be built on a foundation more honest than the secrecy and fear that had defined it for so many decades before. In the quiet days that followed, the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense returned to its usual rhythm of secrecy and hidden vigilance, though the loss of Bruttenholm left a void that no one within its walls could quite fill. Hellboy, having faced the darkest possible version of his own destiny and having chosen, in his most vulnerable moment, to reject it entirely, seemed to settle more fully into the identity Bruttenholm had spent a lifetime nurturing within him, that of a protector rather than a destroyer, a son rather than a demon, a hero built not by prophecy but by choice. His relationship with Liz deepened into something more openly acknowledged, a quiet, steady companionship built on shared understanding of what it meant to carry immense, frightening power and still choose compassion over fear. Myers, having earned his place within the strange, extraordinary family of the Bureau, continued his work alongside Hellboy and Abe, the three of them forming an unlikely but effective team ready to face whatever supernatural threats the world would inevitably continue to produce. In the weeks that followed, life within the Bureau slowly settled into a new, quieter rhythm, though the absence of Bruttenholm's steady presence continued to be felt throughout the underground facility. A modest memorial was arranged within the Bureau's archives in his honor, a small gesture that nonetheless carried enormous weight for the handful of people who had known him best. Manning, despite years of friction with Hellboy over property damage and public exposure, found himself unexpectedly moved during the brief ceremony, quietly acknowledging that Bruttenholm's vision for the Bureau, one built on compassion as much as containment, had shaped the organization far more deeply than any official government directive ever could. Hellboy himself said little during the memorial, choosing instead to leave a single cigar resting atop Bruttenholm's old desk, a private gesture of farewell between a son and the father who had given him a reason to choose humanity over the darkness written into his bones. Liz Sherman, having finally confronted and embraced the very power she had spent her life fearing, found a new sense of confidence in the aftermath of the battle, no longer viewing her fire as something to be endlessly suppressed but as a part of herself she could learn to wield with purpose and control. Her relationship with Hellboy deepened in the quiet months that followed, the two of them settling into an easy, comfortable companionship built on years of unspoken understanding finally given room to breathe. Myers, having proven his courage and loyalty beyond any doubt, earned a permanent place within the strange, extraordinary family of the Bureau, his initial rivalry with Hellboy softening into a genuine mutual respect forged through shared danger and shared loss. Abe Sapien continued his quiet, thoughtful presence within the team, ever the calm center around which the Bureau's more volatile personalities orbited, his psychic insights and dry wit proving just as valuable in the aftermath of crisis as they had been in the heat of battle. The story of Hellboy ultimately became less about the monstrous origins written into his blood and more about the deliberate, ongoing choice to defy those origins at every turn. Born from fire and ancient prophecy, raised by love and human decency, Hellboy stood as a living argument against the idea that destiny alone determines who a person becomes. He remained, in the end, exactly what Bruttenholm had always insisted he was capable of being, not a demon summoned to end the world, but a flawed, sarcastic, cigar-smoking hero who simply chose, again and again, to save it instead. And as the Bureau's underground facility settled once more into its quiet, hidden routine, ready for whatever new supernatural threat the world would inevitably produce, Hellboy carried forward the one lesson his father had spent a lifetime teaching him, that identity was never a matter of birth or blood, but of the choices made in the darkest, most uncertain moments, when the easiest path and the right path rarely happen to be the same. Before the demon ever walked onto a movie screen, 7 very different lives had to converge in Prague, each one carrying its own decades of struggle, reinvention, and quiet persistence. The story of Hellboy is not just the story of a comic book brought to life. It is the story of the people who breathed inside its rubber suits, delivered its lines, and carried its strange, tender heart into the world. To understand why this film still resonates more than 2 decades later, it helps to understand the men and women who made it, because almost every one of them arrived at this project after a long and often unglamorous road. Ron Perlman, the actor who became Hellboy, was born Ronald Francis Perlman on April 13, 1950, in Washington Heights, in Upper Manhattan, New York City. He grew up in a Jewish family with roots in Poland and Hungary, the son of a repairman and jazz drummer father and a mother who worked for the city clerk's office. By his own account, Perlman was an overweight, awkward child who struggled to fit in with his peers, and the discomfort of that early self-image would, strangely enough, become the foundation of his entire career. He found something liberating in the idea of hiding behind a mask or a character, a feeling that would define much of his later work in heavy prosthetics. His path into acting began almost by accident, when his father watched him perform in a school production of Guys and Dolls at Lehman College and was struck by how naturally talented his son seemed. That single moment of encouragement changed the direction of Perlman's life. He pursued a formal theater education, eventually earning a master's degree in theater arts from the University of Minnesota, and returned to New York to chase a career on the stage. His break into professional acting came through classical theater work with a small company called CSC Repertory, which led to his Broadway debut in 1979 in a production called Tybal and Her Demon. Just 2 years later, in 1981, everything shifted when French director Jean-Jacques Annaud cast him in Quest for Fire, a prehistoric drama in which Perlman played one of the earliest human tribesmen. The film was a critical success, earning him a Genie Award nomination in Canada, and it also marked the beginning of a defining pattern in his career, in which directors kept casting him not despite his unconventional looks but because of them. Annaud brought him back 5 years later for The Name of the Rose, based on Umberto Eco's novel, where Perlman played the twisted, unforgettable Salvatore alongside Sean Connery. Through the late 1980s, Perlman found mainstream recognition playing Vincent, a noble lion-like man living in the tunnels beneath New York City, opposite Linda Hamilton in the fantasy series Beauty and the Beast. The role won him a Golden Globe Award and gave him a devoted fanbase, even if true stardom continued to elude him. For much of the 1990s, Perlman worked steadily but without major breakthrough, appearing in genre films and supporting roles, until he crossed paths with a young Mexican director named Guillermo del Toro on the vampire horror film Cronos in 1993. That meeting sparked one of the most important creative partnerships of Perlman's life. Del Toro cast him again in Blade 2 in 2002, and by then had already set his sights on adapting Mike Mignola's comic book Hellboy for the screen, with Perlman as his only choice for the title role. Studios resisted for years, wanting a more bankable star to play the demon detective, But Del Toro fought for nearly 4 years to keep Perlman attached, refusing to compromise. When Hellboy finally reached theaters in 2004, it turned Perlman, at the age of 53 and after almost a quarter-century of near misses, into a genuine star and a beloved face of genre cinema. He would go on to headline the television series Sons of Anarchy as the outlaw biker Clay Morrow, lend his instantly recognizable gravelly voice to the Fallout video game franchise, and continue his collaboration with Del Toro on films including Pacific Rim and Nightmare Alley. Perlman has spoken about how the years before Hellboy were marked by long stretches of silence from casting directors, punctuated by brief flashes of exciting work, and how that unpredictability taught him patience. Married to fashion designer Opal Stone for decades before their eventual divorce, and later remarried, Perlman has remained one of Hollywood's most respected character actors, a man who spent most of his life unrecognized behind masks before becoming, ironically, one of the most recognizable actors of his generation the moment he stepped fully into one. Selma Blair, who played the pyrokinetic Liz Sherman, was born Selma Blair Beitner on June 23, 1972, in Southfield, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit, the youngest of 4 daughters in a Jewish family. Her parents were both lawyers, and her father was active in Democratic politics, giving Blair an upbringing steeped in argument, precision, and intellectual rigor rather than show business. She attended a Jewish day school before enrolling at Cranbrook Kingswood School in Michigan, and her early ambitions were split between photography and performance. She briefly studied at Kalamazoo College and New York University before transferring to the University of Michigan, where she graduated in 1994 with a degree that combined English and photography. Just 1 week after her college graduation, Blair moved to New York City at 21 years old with almost nothing to her name, later describing herself during that period as essentially homeless and staying at facilities run by the Salvation Army while she tried to figure out whether photography or acting was her true calling. She enrolled in acting classes at the Stella Adler Conservatory, and her first professional credit came in an episode of the Nickelodeon children's series The Adventures of Pete and Pete. Small roles in independent films followed throughout the mid-1990s, but Blair's real breakthrough arrived in 1999 with Cruel Intentions, a stylish teen drama in which she played Cecile Caldwell alongside Reese Witherspoon, Sarah Michelle Gellar, and Ryan Phillip. The film became a cult favorite and established Blair as a rising star capable of both comedy and darker material. She followed it with a scene-stealing supporting role in Legally Blonde in 2001 and a starring turn in The Sweetest Thing in 2002 opposite Cameron Diaz, reuniting with her Cruel Intentions director Roger Kumble. By the time Guillermo del Toro cast her in Hellboy in 2004, Blair had already proven she could carry both mainstream comedies and edgier, more emotionally complex work, and Liz Sherman gave her a chance to explore trauma, isolation, and barely contained power in a way her earlier roles had not allowed. She continued working steadily through the 2000s, appearing in John Waters' A Dirty Shame in 2004 and Robert Benton's Feast of Love in 2007, and later moved into television, starring opposite Molly Shannon in the sitcom Kath and Kim, and later joining the ensemble of Anger Management. In 2016 she portrayed Kris Jenner in the acclaimed miniseries The People v. O.J. Simpson, American Crime Story, earning some of the strongest reviews of her career. In October 2018, Blair publicly revealed that she had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and she has since become one of the most visible and candid advocates for awareness of the disease, documenting her experience in the acclaimed 2021 documentary introducing Selma Blair, which premiered to widespread praise at the South by Southwest Film Festival. She later published a memoir titled Mean Baby, reflecting on her childhood, career, and health journey with the same unflinching honesty that has defined her public presence since her diagnosis. Blair's arc, from a homeless 21-year-old actor hopeful to an Emmy-recognized dramatic performer and a fearless public advocate, mirrors the resilience that first drew audiences to Liz Sherman on screen. Doug Jones, who physically embodied the amphibious psychic Abe Sapien beneath layers of blue prosthetics, was born on May 24, 1960, in Indianapolis, Indiana, the youngest of 4 brothers. He attended Bishop Chatard High School before enrolling at Ball State University, where he earned a degree with a minor in theater and, notably, spent time performing as the school's cardinal mascot, an early and unlikely training ground for the physical performance skills that would define his entire career. Jones also developed serious skills as a mime and contortionist, disciplines that would later make him one of the most in-demand creature performers in Hollywood. After graduating, he moved to Los Angeles in 1985 and found his first steady work performing as the surreal, moon-faced Mac Tonight character in a series of McDonald's television commercials, a strange but memorable entry point into professional performance. Through the late 1980s and 1990s, Jones built a career almost entirely built around physical transformation, appearing in projects that required him to disappear into non-human characters through heavy makeup and prosthetics, including a memorable turn as the goofy zombie Billy Butcherson in Hocus Pocus in 1993. That same decade, while working on the horror film Mimic in 1997, Jones met Guillermo del Toro, and the two formed a friendship rooted in a shared love of monsters and creature design that would shape much of both of their careers going forward. Del Toro began casting Jones in project after project, and when Hellboy went into production, Jones was the clear choice to physically embody Abe Sapien, spending hours each day in an elaborate rubber suit designed to convey grace and intelligence despite the character's alien appearance. Interestingly, while Jones performed the character's full physicality on set, his voice in the finished 2004 film was dubbed over by actor David Hyde Pierce, who went uncredited, a decision the production made for reasons related to marketability. By the time the sequel, Hellboy 2, The Golden Army, arrived in 2008, Jones had earned the right to provide both the physical performance and the voice himself, delivering what is widely regarded as an even more layered take on the character. Jones's collaboration with Del Toro extended across numerous other projects, including his haunting dual performance as the Faun and the Pale Man in Pan's Labyrinth in 2006, a role that showcased his ability to convey both tenderness and horror through movement alone, and later his romantic lead performance as the Amphibian Man in the Shape of Water in 2017, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture. He also took on the role of the Silver Surfer in Fantastic Four, Rise of the Silver Surfer, though his voice was replaced there as well, this time by Lawrence Fishburne. In more recent years, Jones found mainstream recognition without prosthetics for the first time in his career, playing Captain Sorrow on the television series Star Trek: Discovery, a role that allowed audiences to appreciate the subtlety and warmth of his performance style even without the layers of makeup that had defined most of his previous work. Jones has often described his career with a mixture of humor and pride, noting that for decades he worked constantly while remaining almost entirely unrecognized in public, a paradox that has slowly begun to shift as his contributions to modern creature performance have become more widely celebrated within the industry. Rupert Evans, who played the young, morally uncertain FBI agent John Myers, was born on March 9, 1976, in Staffordshire, England, and was raised on a farm near Stoke-on-Trent by his grandmother, since his parents were often occupied with their own careers. He attended Bilton Grange School before moving on to Milton Abbey School in Dorset, and he later trained formally at the Webber Douglas Academy of Dramatic Art in London, one of Britain's respected conservatories for stage performance. Evans began his professional career in the early 2000s working almost entirely in British television, landing his first roles in 2001 on the sitcom High Stakes alongside veteran actor Richard Wilson and on the family comedy My Family. The following year he took on a recurring role in the drama Paradise Heights and appeared in the series Rockface, steadily building a resume in the kind of homegrown British television work that rarely translates into international recognition. That changed dramatically when Guillermo del Toro cast him as John Myers in Hellboy, a role that became Evans's first major film and his first true introduction to American audiences. Evans has spoken candidly about how overwhelming the experience was at the time, describing how he went from expecting to spend his year performing in a regional theater production to suddenly being flown to Prague for a demanding 168-day shoot alongside seasoned performers like Ron Perlman and John Hurt. He has called the experience nerve-wracking and terrifying, but also one of the most formative turning points of his career, crediting it with teaching him how to work at a professional film level almost overnight. In the same year Hellboy was released, Evans also appeared in the BBC miniseries North and South, playing Frederick Hale, and the following year he took a role in the acclaimed adaptation of Fingersmith. Rather than immediately chasing further Hollywood blockbusters, Evans shifted much of his focus back toward British theatre and independent film, including a period performing with the Royal Shakespeare Company, where he took on roles such as Romeo and the Dauphin in King John, and a striking performance as Valentine in Kiss of the Spider-Woman at London's Donmar Warehouse Theatre. His film work continued through the 2010s with roles in the horror thriller The Canal in 2014, which earned him some of the best reviews of his career, and the horror mystery The Boy in 2016, alongside Lauren Cohan. That same year, he appeared in American Pastoral, directed by and co-starring Ewan McGregor. Evans found a major resurgence in profile when he was cast as Frank Frink in the Amazon Prime series The Man in the High Castle, an alternate history drama based on Philip K. Dick's novel, in which he played a Jewish man forced to hide his identity in a world where the Axis powers won the Second World War. Following that series, he joined the cast of the CW reboot of Charmed, playing Harry Greenwood, the Witch Sister's guide, further cementing his standing in American television. Evans has described the original Hellboy shoot as a formative shock to his system as a young actor, one that set the tone for a career built on steady, versatile work across television, film, and stage rather than a single defining blockbuster franchise. John Hurt, who brought quiet gravity and paternal warmth to the role of Professor Trevor Bruttenholm, was born John Vincent Hurt on January 22, 1940, in England, and would go on to become one of the most respected and instantly recognizable character actors of his generation before his death from pancreatic cancer on January 25, 2017. At the age of 77. Hurt trained at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London, graduating in 1962 and beginning his professional career that same year with a role in The Wild and the Willing. His early stage work included performances in Harold Pinter's The Dwarfs, and he built a reputation through the 1960s as an actor drawn to unconventional, often damaged or eccentric characters rather than conventional leading men. His breakthrough film role came in 1966 with A Man for All Seasons, in which he played Richard Rich, but it was his devastating performance in the 1975 television film The Naked Civil Servant, portraying the openly gay author and raconteur Quentin Crisp, that truly established him as an actor willing to take enormous professional risks. Hurt later admitted that many people warned him the role could end his career entirely, given how rare and controversial such a portrayal was for British television at the time, but the performance instead became one of the defining moments of his early career. Through the late 1970s, Hurt earned international recognition and a BAFTA award along with an Academy Award nomination for his role as a prisoner in the harrowing prison drama Midnight Express in 1978. The following year, 1979, he appeared as Kane in Ridley Scott's Alien, delivering one of science fiction cinema's most infamous and enduring moments in the film's chestburster scene. In 1980 he starred as Joseph Merrick in David Lynch's The Elephant Man, a performance many critics consider the finest of his career, earning him both a BAFTA award and a second Academy Award nomination, this time for Best Actor. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Hurt continued building an extraordinarily varied filmography, playing Winston Smith in the 1984 adaptation of George Orwell's 1984, appearing in Rob Roy in 1995, and taking on countless stage roles with the Royal Shakespeare Company between film projects. By the time Guillermo del Toro cast him as Professor Bruttenholm in Hellboy in 2004, Hurt was already a screen legend in his 60s, and his presence lent the young franchise an unmistakable sense of weight and legitimacy. He reprised the role in a smaller capacity for the sequel in 2008 and voiced the character for the animated feature Hellboy Animated, Blood and Iron in 2007. In the years that followed, Hurt continued working at a remarkable pace, appearing as the sinister High Chancellor Adam Sutler in V for Vendetta in 2006, playing Professor Oxley in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull in 2008, and charming a new generation of younger audiences as the wand-maker Garrick Ollivander across the Harry Potter film series. A role he carried from the franchise's beginning in 2001 through its conclusion in 2011. Hurt was knighted in 2015 in recognition of his decades of contribution to British cinema, and continued acting even after revealing his cancer diagnosis, working through treatment until shortly before his death. Across a career spanning more than 5 decades and over 200 credits, Hurt remained defined by his willingness to disappear into vulnerable, complicated, and often uncomfortable characters, a quality that made his warm, fatherly performance as Professor Bruttenholm feel all the more affecting by contrast. Jeffrey Tambor, who played the gruff but ultimately sympathetic bureau director Tom Manning, was born Jeffrey Michael Tambor on July 8, 1944, in the Sunset District of San Francisco, California, and raised in the nearby Park Merced neighborhood in a conservative Jewish family with roots in Hungary and Russia. He developed an interest in performing as a child, taking his first acting lessons at the age of 12, and went on to study theater formally at San Francisco State University, graduating with a bachelor's degree in 1965. He then pursued graduate studies at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, earning a Master of Fine Arts degree in 1969 and beginning work toward a doctorate before leaving the program in 1970 to take a stage opportunity performing alongside veteran actor Richard Chamberlain in a production of Richard II at the Seattle Repertory Theater. Tambor spent much of the early 1970s building a career in regional and repertory theater before making his Broadway debut in 1976 in the comedy Sly Fox, appearing alongside George C. Scott under the direction of Arthur Penn. His transition to screen work began later that decade with guest appearances on television staples like Kojak, Starsky and Hutch, and Taxi, and his film debut came in 1979 with a critically praised performance as Al Pacino's unraveling law partner in Norman Jewison's courtroom drama And Justice for All. Through the 1980s, Tambor became a familiar face on American television, landing a long-running recurring role as a judge on Hill Street Blues and appearing across a wide range of comedies and dramas, while also taking supporting film roles in movies like Mr. Mom and City Slickers. His most significant early career breakthrough came in 1992 when he was cast as the vain, insecure sidekick Hank Kingsley on the HBO series The Larry Sanders Show, a role that ran for 6 seasons and earned him 4 Emmy Award nominations along with numerous other industry honors, cementing his reputation as one of television's finest comic performers. After that show ended in 1998, Tambor moved into a string of notable supporting film roles, appearing in There's Something About Mary, Girl Interrupted, and Meet Joe Black, before returning to television in 2003 to play the imprisoned patriarch George Bluth Sr., and later his twin brother Oscar, on the acclaimed comedy series Arrested Development, a role he would return to across multiple revivals through 2019. By the time Guillermo del Toro cast him in Hellboy in 2004, Tambor was already one of the most respected comic character actors working in American television, and his performance as the exasperated, overwhelmed bureau chief gave the film some of its sharpest comic relief. In the years that followed, Tambor took on what would become the most acclaimed and most complicated role of his career, portraying Maura Pfefferman, a trans woman navigating a late-in-life gender transition, on the Amazon series Transparent beginning in 2014. The performance earned him a Golden Globe Award and 2 Primetime Emmy Awards for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Comedy Series. In 2017, however, Tambor's career was significantly disrupted when sexual harassment allegations were made against him by colleagues on Transparent, resulting in his departure from the series and prompting broader industry conversations about workplace conduct. Tambor has denied the most serious allegations while acknowledging that his behavior on set had, at times, created a difficult environment. Despite the controversy, his body of work across 5 decades, from live theater in the Pacific Northwest to some of American television's most celebrated comedies, remains a significant part of entertainment history, and his brief but memorable turn in Hellboy remains a beloved piece of that legacy for fans of the film. Karel Roden, who portrayed the resurrected mystic Grigory Rasputin, was born on May 18, 1962, in České Budějovice, in what was then Czechoslovakia. Acting ran in his family, as both his father and grandfather had worked as performers, and Roden followed that same path almost as a matter of inheritance. He first studied ceramics at an art secondary school before being accepted into the prestigious Academy of Performing Arts in Prague, a formal training ground that would shape his entire approach to performance. Roden's film career began in 1984, almost simultaneously with his stage work, when he took the role of a medical student named Hansa in a light-hearted trilogy of Czech films exploring university life under socialism, and he reprised the character across multiple installments of that series. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Roden built a substantial reputation within Czech cinema and theater, becoming a member of the prestigious Prague National Theatre and taking on a wide range of comic and dramatic roles, including a memorable turn as a soldier in a satirical look at life in the Socialist Czech Army. His performance in the 1996 film Král Ubu earned him a Czech Lion Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, and brought him significant recognition at home, laying the groundwork for an eventual move into international productions. By the early 2000s, Roden had begun appearing in English-language Hollywood films, often cast because of his commanding presence and distinct Eastern European features, taking supporting roles in 15 Minutes alongside Robert De Niro in 2001, Blade 2 in 2002, where he first crossed paths with Guillermo del Toro, and Bulletproof Monk in 2003. That same period saw him appear in The Bourne Supremacy in 2004, opposite Matt Damon, further establishing him internationally as a reliable and intense supporting performer. When Del Toro began casting Hellboy, he brought Roden back for a much larger and more central role as the resurrected Russian mystic Grigory Rasputin, the film's central antagonist, whose obsession with apocalyptic prophecy drives much of the plot. The role allowed Roden to display a far wider dramatic range than many of his earlier Hollywood parts had permitted, and it remains one of the performances he is most widely recognized for internationally. Following Hellboy, Roden continued working steadily across both Czech and international productions, appearing as a Russian mobster in the action thriller Running Scared in 2006 alongside Paul Walker, and taking on the role of a Russian billionaire loosely inspired by real-life oligarch Roman Abramovich in Guy Ritchie's Rock'n'Rolla in 2008. He also brought unexpected comic timing to his supporting role as a Russian film critic in Mr. Bean's Holiday in 2007, alongside Rowan Atkinson, and continued to work extensively in European co-productions, including the historical drama Bathory in 2008, directed by Slovak filmmaker Juraj Jakubisko. Roden also lent his voice to a major supporting character in the video game Grand Theft Auto 4, extending his reach into interactive entertainment. He later won the Czech Lion Award for Best Actor for his leading role in the film Guard No. 47, cementing his reputation at home even as his international profile continued to grow through further genre and thriller work in the years that followed. Roden's younger brother, Marion, is also an actor, continuing a family tradition of performance that now spans 3 generations, and Karel Roden himself remains one of the most respected and internationally recognized actors to emerge from the Czech Republic in the post-communist era. Together, these 7 performers, an overweight kid from Washington Heights who learned to hide behind masks, a homeless 21-year-old chasing photography and acting in New York, a mime who spent 30 years unrecognized under layers of prosthetics, a young British actor thrown into a 168-day shoot with almost no preparation, a knighted legend of British cinema in the twilight of an extraordinary career, a stage comedian who became one of television's most complicated and celebrated figures, and a Czech actor carrying 3 generations of family tradition on his shoulders, came together in Prague to build something that has endured for more than 2 decades. Each of them arrived at Hellboy from a completely different direction, shaped by struggle, reinvention, or decades of quiet persistence, and each of them left something permanent behind in the film's strange, beating heart. If their stories moved you the way they moved me putting this together, take a moment to hit that like button, share this video with a fellow Hellboy fan, and subscribe for more deep dives into the people and stories behind the movies you love. Every great cult film seems to carry with it a slightly chaotic financial story, and Hellboy is no exception. To really appreciate what Guillermo del Toro pulled off in 2004, you have to start with the numbers, because they tell a story of a director fighting an uphill battle against the studio system that never quite knew what to make of his strange, tender monster movie. The film's final production budget landed somewhere between $60 and $66 million, a figure that sounds substantial until you place it next to the comic book blockbusters being released around the same era. When Hellboy opened in American theaters on April 2, 2004, distributed by Columbia Pictures through Revolution Studios, it earned a domestic total of just under $60 million, adding another $40 million or so from international markets to bring its worldwide haul to roughly $99.8 million. On paper, that made Hellboy profitable, since it cleared its production costs, but in the unforgiving math of studio filmmaking, where a movie is often expected to earn back 2 to 2.5 times its budget once marketing and distribution costs are factored in, Hellboy landed in an awkward middle ground. It was either a flop that got quietly buried nor a runaway hit that spawned an immediate cinematic universe. Instead, critics and film historians have since taken to calling it an acclaimed flop, a movie that earned glowing reviews and a passionate fanbase while only modestly clearing its financial bar at the box office. What ultimately saved the franchise, and arguably saved Del Toro's career trajectory in Hollywood at that moment, was the film's extraordinary performance on home video. In an era when DVD sales still meant real money for studios, audiences who had missed Hellboy in theaters discovered it at home in huge numbers, and that afterlife on video shelves is largely credited with convincing Sony and its partners to greenlight a sequel. Hellboy 2, The Golden Army arrived in 2008 with a considerably larger budget of around $85 million and went on to make roughly $168 million worldwide, a clear step up, though even that sequel arrived in theaters just 1 week before The Dark Knight absolutely dominated the box office, which limited its longer theatrical run. Del Toro had originally envisioned Hellboy as the start of a trilogy, and for years afterward there was persistent hope among fans that a third film would eventually materialize, but the financial reality of 2 movies that performed well but not spectacularly meant the numbers never quite lined up for a studio to take that risk, and the trilogy remained unfinished under Del Toro's direction. To understand why the budget for the first film mattered so much, you have to go back even further, to the years before a single frame of Hellboy was shot, when the entire project existed only as a stubborn dream in Guillermo del Toro's head. Mike Mignola's comic book, first appearing in 1993 and launched as an ongoing series through Dark Horse Comics in 1994, had a devoted following, but it was hardly a mainstream household name on the level of Batman or Spider-Man, and that made Hollywood studios deeply nervous about bankrolling an expensive adaptation. According to Del Toro's own recollections, studio executives balked at nearly everything about the project from the earliest pitch meetings. They reportedly objected to the word hell appearing in the title at all, worried it would alienate audiences or draw religious backlash. They floated alternative concepts that would have fundamentally changed the character, including one truly bizarre suggestion that Hellboy should look like an ordinary man who only transformed into his demonic red form when he became angry, essentially reworking him into a version of the Hulk. Another idea batted around by nervous studio suits was even stranger, proposing that instead of a giant red demon, the title character could simply be a man accompanied by a large red demonic dog. Del Toro has said, with evident exasperation even years later, that these pitches sound almost comical in retrospect, but at the time they represented real threats to the vision he was trying to protect. Casting was its own battleground. The studio wanted a bigger, more bankable name in the lead role, and names like Dwayne Johnson, Nicolas Cage, and Vin Diesel were all floated as alternatives to the far less famous character actor Del Toro and Mignola both wanted. According to the film's own DVD commentary, when Mignola and Del Toro first sat down to discuss who should play the title role, they did not go through any elaborate audition process or debate multiple contenders. They simply said the same name to each other at the same time, Ron Perlman. It became a matter of principle for Del Toro, who had worked with Perlman on Kronos in 1993 and Blade 2 in 2002, and who refused to consider replacing him no matter how much pressure came from above. That standoff lasted for years, with Del Toro effectively staking his own growing directorial reputation, fresh off the success of Blade 2, on getting Perlman cast. The studio's fixation on Vin Diesel did not end once Perlman secured the lead role either. There was reportedly continued interest in casting Diesel as Abe Sapien, the psychic amphibious agent, even after Hellboy himself had already been cast, though that idea eventually faded and the role instead went to Del Toro's frequent collaborator and creature performance specialist, Doug Jones. Perhaps the most remarkable footnote to this entire saga of stubborn conviction is what Del Toro turned down in order to make Hellboy happen at all. Around the same period, Warner Brothers was searching for a new director to take over the Harry Potter franchise after Christopher Columbus stepped away following the first two films. Del Toro has confirmed that he was approached about directing Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, a film that eventually went to Alfonso Cuarón and is now widely regarded by fans and critics as one of the finest entries in that entire franchise. Del Toro, despite being a genuine fan of the books, turned the opportunity down because he felt his own directorial sensibility would not mesh naturally with the established tone of the series, but more importantly because he finally had his long-fought chance to make Hellboy and refused to let it slip away for a second time. In an odd twist revealed years later, it was actually Del Toro himself who encouraged Cuarón to take on the Potter franchise before Cuarón had even read the books, meaning Del Toro's decision to prioritize his passion project indirectly shaped the future of an entirely different, far larger franchise. Once the film finally received its green light, production moved to Prague in the Czech Republic, a city that would come to double for several very different real-world locations throughout the finished movie, including scenes meant to represent New Jersey and the fictional Eastern European region of Moldavia. Prague had already become something of a favored destination for large-scale genre productions by the early 2000s, offering a combination of grand, Gothic architecture, skilled local crews, and production costs considerably lower than shooting the same sets in Los Angeles or London. For a film that needed to build an enormous underground headquarters for the Bureau of Paranormal Research and Defense, complete with a hallway lined with preserved creatures in jars, along with crumbling Gothic cathedrals, Nazi occult bunkers, and a climactic sequence involving ancient mechanical gods, Prague's studio facilities and production infrastructure made the $60 to $66 million budget stretch considerably further than it would have anywhere in North America. Del Toro, a filmmaker famous for his obsessive attention to production design and his enormous personal collections of monster art, notebooks, and reference sketches, treated the sets almost as extensions of his own imagination, filling background details with the kind of dense visual texture that rewards audiences who rewatch the film specifically to catch things they missed the first time. Eagle-eyed fans have since pointed out that the Hall of Antiquities inside the Bureau's facility includes a small visual nod to Del Toro's earlier Spanish-language film The Devil's Backbone, with one of that film's eerie preserved jar babies quietly placed among the set dressing, a tiny signature hidden in plain sight for anyone paying close enough attention. No discussion of the making of Hellboy would be complete without diving into the sheer physical toll that the film's practical, prosthetics-heavy approach placed on its two lead creature performers, Ron Perlman and Doug Jones, because their daily experience on set looked almost nothing like a typical Hollywood shoot. Del Toro made a deliberate choice, one that increasingly set him apart from a film industry rapidly shifting toward digital effects, to rely primarily on practical makeup and prosthetics rather than computer-generated imagery for his creatures wherever possible. That decision fell to the design team at Rick Baker's Cinovation Studio, with makeup artist Jake Garber, who had previously worked with Perlman on Star Trek, Nemesis, personally requested by the actor to lead his transformation into Hellboy. Garber has described the daily process in detail, explaining that Perlman would typically be allotted around 4 hours for the transformation, though the actual time spent sitting motionless in the chair usually ran closer to 2.5 hours, with breaks built in so Perlman could stretch his legs, grab a cup of coffee, or eat a bit of breakfast rather than enduring one unbroken, grueling sitting. Even with those small mercies, applying Hellboy's sculpted muscles, filed down horn stumps, yellow contact lenses, and the character's signature enormous stone right hand was a demanding daily ritual that shaped the entire rhythm of the production schedule. Doug Jones's transformation into Abe Sapien was, if anything, even more intense. Reports from the documentary. To really understand Hellboy, you have to understand that Guillermo del Toro was never simply adapting a comic book. He was adapting a mythology, one that Mike Mignola had spent a decade quietly stitching together out of real historical horror, half-forgotten folklore, and the pulp fiction and comic art that shaped both men's childhoods. When the film opened in American theaters in April of 2004, it landed in a very specific cultural moment, one that makes its existence, let alone its success, something of a small miracle when you look at it in hindsight. The early 2000s were the years when comic book movies were still fighting for basic legitimacy as a genre. Blade had proven a mostly overlooked R-rated vampire hunter could work on screen, X-Men had shown that ensemble mutant stories could be taken seriously, and Spider-Man had become a genuine cultural phenomenon in 2002, but the wounds from the disastrous Batman sequels of the 1990s, films that had dragged the entire genre toward high camp and neon absurdity, were still fresh in the industry's memory. Studios were only beginning to look past the two most obvious publishers, Marvel and DC, to find other properties worth adapting, and a strange, red-skinned demon from a mid-sized independent publisher called Dark Horse Comics was, by any reasonable studio logic, a significant gamble. In fact, according to interviews Del Toro has given over the years, an earlier version of this film could have reached theaters as far back as 1998, but the pervasive stigma surrounding comic book adaptations at that point in Hollywood history kept the project shelved for years, pushing Del Toro toward Blade 2 first as a way of proving he could handle large-scale genre material before returning to his true passion project. When Hellboy finally did open on April 2, 2004, it entered a box office landscape crowded with cultural heavyweights. That same year, audiences were also flocking to Spider-Man 2, one of the most critically acclaimed superhero films ever made, and the counter-programming comedy Dodgeball. But perhaps the most telling detail of Hellboy's specific release window is the film it briefly dethroned, and then lost ground to at the American box office. Hellboy opened at number 1 on its debut weekend, but the very next weekend happened to be Easter Sunday, and Mel Gibson's deeply controversial religious epic The Passion of the Christ, which had already been in theaters since February, surged back to the top of the box office charts on the strength of the holiday. There is something almost poetically strange about a film centered on a literal demon fighting to resist an apocalyptic destiny being commercially overshadowed, on the most sacred weekend of the Christian calendar, by a film about the crucifixion. It is a small but telling snapshot of just how loaded the cultural terrain around religious imagery was in America during that particular spring, and that same tension followed Hellboy throughout its theatrical run in more direct ways as well. Because the film's marketing so openly embraced its title character's literal demonic nature, complete with filed-down horns, a tail, and a name containing the word hell in bold red letters on every poster, the film ran into genuine, organized resistance from conservative religious groups and retailers. Some major toy store chains reportedly refused to stock Hellboy action figures and merchandise, uncomfortable with putting a demon on their shelves regardless of the character's heroic function within the story. Certain theater chains in more religiously conservative markets in the American South reportedly declined to show the film under its original title at all, and in some cases, marketing materials in those regions altered the title slightly to something closer to Hellboy, an almost absurd compromise meant to soften the word hell into something that sounded more like a greeting than a place of eternal damnation. Despite all of this friction, the film went on to receive strong reviews and multiple award nominations, proving that audiences willing to actually watch the movie found very little to object to in its surprisingly warm, even Catholic-inflected morality, in which a creature born of literal hellfire chooses, again and again, to protect humanity rather than destroy it. That tension between demonic imagery and genuinely earnest moral storytelling did not happen by accident. It reflects something deeply personal about Guillermo del Toro himself, a filmmaker raised in Guadalajara, Mexico, in a culture steeped in Catholic iconography, religious pageantry, and a folk tradition that treats death, monsters, and the supernatural not as things to be feared and banished but as neighbors to be understood, negotiated with, and sometimes even loved. Del Toro has spoken at length over the years about how his childhood fascination with monsters was never really about horror for horror's sake, but about empathy for the outsider, for the thing that looks grotesque on the surface but carries a tender, often wounded interior. That worldview runs through nearly everything he has ever directed, from the ghost story Kronos to the fascist-haunted fairy tale of Pan's Labyrinth to his eventual Academy Award-winning romance between a woman and an amphibious creature in the shape of water, and Hellboy sits comfortably at the center of that thematic lineage. Del Toro's Hellboy is not really a story about a superhero saving the world from evil in the way that, say, Superman fights Lex Luthor. It is a story about a being who was literally summoned from hell as an infant by Nazi occultists, raised by a kind, adoptive human father figure instead, and who spends his entire life negotiating the gap between what he was destined to become and what he chooses to become instead. That theme of chosen family over predetermined fate runs through the entire film, and it mirrors Del Toro's broader artistic obsession with characters who exist between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, forced to define themselves through their own choices rather than the categories the world tries to place them in. The historical foundation underneath all of this fantasy is more real, and considerably stranger, than most casual viewers probably realize. The film opens in 1944, at the tail end of the Second World War, with a joint American and British military operation raiding a Nazi occult ritual site on the remote Scottish island of Ptarmigan, where a Rasputin-led cabal is attempting to open a portal to unleash apocalyptic entities called the Ogdru Jihad. This premise is not simply Mignola inventing wholesale fiction out of thin air. Nazi Germany's genuine historical fascination with occultism, mysticism, and pseudo-archaeological mythology is very well documented, even if its practical influence on actual military strategy has often been exaggerated in popular culture. The Thule Society, a real German occult and nationalist organization founded in Munich in the years following the First World War, promoted a mixture of folkish nationalism, esoteric spirituality, and pseudo-scientific racial theory that historians widely credit as one of the ideological precursors feeding into the earliest formation of the Nazi Party. Its members were fascinated with ideas about ancient Aryan origins, lost civilizations, and secret spiritual wisdom, a real historical undercurrent that later found its way into countless works of fiction, from Indiana Jones to Wolfenstein to Hellboy, precisely because the historical reality was already so strange that it barely required embellishment to become the stuff of pulp adventure. Interestingly, and this is a detail that rarely makes it into casual film discussion, the actual Thule Society itself had dissolved before Hitler formally rose to power, and organized occult activity was later suppressed within official Nazi structures, in part because Heinrich Himmler cultivated his own personal occultist, a man named Karl Maria Willigut, who wanted his particular brand of mysticism, built around the worship of a Germanic god and elaborate claims about a prehistoric era, populated by giants and multiple suns, to be the dominant esoteric philosophy within the party rather than tolerating competing occult factions. Mignola and Del Toro were clearly drawing on this genuine, well-documented historical weirdness, using it as fertile ground to imagine a secret magical war running parallel to the real conflict of the Second World War, one in which the ordinary Allied soldiers raiding that Scottish ritual site have no idea they are about to stumble into something that will alter the shape of the supernatural world for decades to come. Then there is Rasputin himself, and here the film takes considerably more creative liberty, resurrecting a man who, in reality, had already been dead for nearly 3 decades by the time the film's 1944 prologue takes place. The historical Grigory Rasputin was born around 1869 in the remote Siberian village of Pokrovskoye, the son of peasants, and by most accounts led an unruly, dissolute youth marked by drinking, petty theft, and a reputation for troublemaking before undergoing what appears to have been a genuine religious awakening in his 20s. He abandoned conventional family life to wander as an itinerant religious pilgrim, eventually making his way to St. Petersburg around 1905, a period when interest in mysticism, spiritualism, and alternative healing practices had become genuinely fashionable among Russia's aristocratic elite. Rasputin's real historical significance comes from his ability, whether through genuine skill, sheer charisma, or simple coincidence, to ease the suffering of Alexei, the hemophiliac heir to the Russian throne, during medical crises that left the boy's own doctors helpless. That single relationship gave Rasputin extraordinary access to the innermost circle of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra, and his growing influence over the royal family, combined with widespread rumors of his heavy drinking and predatory sexual behavior toward his mostly female followers, made him one of the most scandalous and destabilizing figures in the final years of the Russian Empire. Historians generally agree that Rasputin's toxic reputation, whether entirely accurate or exaggerated by his many political enemies, helped discredit the already fragile legitimacy of the Tsarist government in the eyes of the Russian public, contributing to the broader collapse that led into the Russian Revolution. His actual death, which took place on December 30, 1916, has itself become the stuff of legend, with popular mythology long claiming he survived poisoning, multiple gunshots, and being thrown into an icy river before finally succumbing, a story so cinematic that it has fueled decades of dramatization. Recent historical scholarship examining the original autopsy findings has actually pushed back hard against that legend, concluding that Rasputin most likely died from gunshot wounds alone, with no poison found in his system at all, meaning the icy river was simply where his body ended up after death rather than the actual cause of it. He was killed by a group of conservative Russian noblemen who saw him as a dangerous, corrupting influence on the crown, a real assassination carried out in December of 1916 in Petrograd. Mignola and Del Toro take this genuinely fascinating, already mythologized historical figure and simply extend his story into full-blown supernatural fiction, imagining that Rasputin did not truly die that night but instead achieved a kind of magical undeath through occult means, allowing him to resurface decades later as the Nazi-aligned sorcerer driving the plot of Hellboy. It is a clever piece of historical remixing, taking a man whose real life already reads like something out of a Gothic novel and pushing him one step further into full supernatural villainy, while keeping just enough of the real historical detail, the Russian mysticism, the aristocratic obsession with the occult, the aura of dark, seductive charisma, to make the fictional version feel grounded in something the audience half remembers as true. Beyond the specific historical borrowings around Nazi occultism and Rasputin, the deeper cultural architecture of Hellboy comes from Mike Mignola's lifelong immersion in a very particular strand of American and European literary and artistic tradition. When Mignola published the very first collected edition of the original Hellboy story, titled Seed of Destruction, in the mid-1990s, he dedicated the book to two figures who tower over the entire history of American fantasy and horror storytelling, the pulp horror writer H.P. Lovecraft and the legendary comic book artist Jack Kirby. Those two names alone tell you almost everything about where Hellboy's DNA comes from. From Kirby, whose bold, blocky figures and heavy, dramatic line work defined much of Marvel Comics' golden era and who created characters like the New Gods and Etrigan the Demon, Mignola inherited a visual language built on stark contrast, hulking silhouettes, and a sense of cosmic scale, where characters often feel small against the vast, ancient forces surrounding them. The legendary comic writer Alan Moore, in praising Mignola's distinctive style, once memorably described it as looking like German Expressionism colliding head-on with Jack Kirby, a description that captures both the moody, shadow-heavy atmosphere of Mignola's artwork and its roots in classic superhero dynamism. From Lovecraft, meanwhile, Mignola absorbed an entire cosmology of dread, the idea that humanity's greatest terror is not any single monster but the creeping realization that vast, ancient, uncaring intelligences exist beyond human comprehension, waiting at the edges of reality for the chance to break through. Throughout the Hellboy comics, this Lovecraftian influence manifests most directly through the Agdra Jihad, gigantic imprisoned entities whose eventual awakening threatens the destruction of the entire world, a direct echo of Lovecraft's own great old ones sealed away and dreaming of their return. Mignola has been careful over the years to clarify that he never wanted to simply copy Lovecraft outright, explaining in interviews that while that influence is absolutely present, he was equally inspired by pulp adventure writers like Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, whose wandering, episodic hero format, in which a rugged protagonist stumbles from one self-contained adventure into the next, shaped the loose, short story structure of many Hellboy comic arcs far more directly than most readers realize. Layered on top of these American pulp influences is a thick vein of European Gothic literature and global folklore that Mignola wove into the growing Hellboy mythology as the series matured, drawing explicitly on Bram Stoker's Dracula, on Russian folk tales involving the witch Baba Yaga and household spirits called Domova, and on a wide range of international myth and legend that gave later Hellboy stories, particularly the acclaimed Darkness Calls arc, the immersive quality of stepping directly into an ancient folk epic rather than a conventional superhero narrative. Del Toro, for his part, brought his own parallel set of gothic and folkloric obsessions to the adaptation, and the resulting film blends Mignola's pulp cosmic horror with Del Toro's Catholic, Mexican, fairy tale sensibility so seamlessly that audiences often assume the entire mythology sprang from a single unified artistic vision rather than two deeply compatible but distinct creative minds meeting in the middle. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how unusual it was, in the specific commercial landscape of 2004, for a major studio film to embrace this much genuine literary and historical density. Most comic book adaptations of that era were still being cautiously simplified for mass audiences, trimmed of anything that might feel too strange, too niche, or too intellectually demanding for a general movie-going crowd expecting straightforward action spectacle. Hellboy instead leaned directly into its mythological complexity, trusting audiences to follow references to Lovecraftian cosmic horror, Slavic folklore, real Nazi occult history, and a fictionalized Rasputin without dumbing any of it down into simpler, more digestible terms. That confidence paid off critically even as it likely limited the film's mainstream commercial ceiling, and it set an important precedent for the kind of densely referential, genre-literate comic book filmmaking that would later become far more common once studios realized audiences were hungrier for mythological depth than executives had assumed. In many ways, Hellboy quietly paved a cultural path that later films and directors would walk more confidently, demonstrating that a comic book movie did not need to sand down its stranger edges or apologize for its source material's eccentricities in order to find critical acclaim and a devoted audience. The film's central romantic relationship between Hellboy and Liz Sherman also deserves cultural examination, because, as strange as it sounds, it did not actually exist in Mignola's original comics at all. According to the behind-the-scenes documentary produced alongside the film, this entire romantic thread was invented by Del Toro himself during the adaptation process, born from his fascination with the visual and emotional irony of pairing a woman whose body could spontaneously combust with a man whose thick, demonic hide made him essentially fireproof. Mignola, for his part, had given Del Toro considerable creative freedom to reshape elements of the story as needed for a feature film adaptation, understanding intuitively that a 2-hour movie and an ongoing comic book series are simply different artistic forms with different structural needs, and he trusted Del Toro's instincts enough not to interfere with this significant addition. That romantic subplot ended up becoming one of the emotional anchors of the entire film, reframing what could have been a much colder, more plot-mechanical apocalypse story into something built around loneliness, longing, and the very human fear of being either too dangerous or too monstrous to ever be truly loved, themes that resonate across nearly all of Del Toro's other work as well. It is a clear example of how the process of adapting a beloved comic book into a mainstream feature film in the early 2000s required real, thoughtful invention rather than simple, literal translation, and how the best adaptations of that era earned their place in cultural memory precisely because they understood which elements of the source material needed to be preserved exactly, and which needed to be reimagined from the ground up. Culturally speaking, Hellboy also occupies a fascinating position as a kind of hinge point in Guillermo del Toro's own career trajectory, one that had ripple effects across the broader landscape of genre filmmaking for the following 2 decades. Before Hellboy, Del Toro was a respected but still relatively niche filmmaker known primarily within horror and genre circles for Cronos and Mimic, along with the acclaimed but commercially modest Spanish Civil War ghost story The Devil's Backbone. Hellboy represented his first true large-scale English-language studio production with major financial backing, and its critical success, even without matching blockbuster box office numbers, gave him the credibility and industry trust needed to pursue increasingly ambitious projects. Just 2 years after Hellboy's release, Del Toro would direct Pan's Labyrinth, a Spanish-language fairy tale set against the brutal backdrop of fascist Spain following the Civil War, a film that went on to win 3 Academy Awards and cement his reputation as one of the most singular visual storytellers working anywhere in the world. That later triumph, and the entire remarkable career that followed it, including his eventual Best Director and Best Picture wins for The Shape of Water, can be traced in part back to the industry goodwill and audience trust that Hellboy's critical reception earned him. In that sense, the cultural legacy of this particular film extends well beyond its own modest box office performance, and reaches into the broader trajectory of one of modern cinema's most distinctive auteurs. The film's afterlife on home video also tells its own small but meaningful cultural story about how audiences actually engaged with genre cinema in the mid-2000s, a period sitting right at the tail end of the DVD era before streaming fundamentally reshaped how people discovered and rewatched films. Hellboy's theatrical run, while respectable, left it categorized by many industry observers at the time as a disappointment relative to its budget, yet the film found an entirely new life once it reached video store shelves and, crucially, once audiences who had skipped it in theaters began renting and purchasing it in large numbers after hearing enthusiastic word of mouth from friends and early critics. This pattern, in which a film underperforms in its initial theatrical window only to be effectively rescued and elevated to cult or franchise status through home video consumption, was a distinctly early to mid-2000s phenomenon, one that simply does not exist in quite the same form in the modern streaming landscape, where a film's commercial fate is typically determined far more quickly, and with far less room for this kind of slow burn rediscovery. That DVD-driven resurgence is specifically credited with convincing the studio to greenlight Hellboy 2, The Golden Army 4 years later, meaning the entire continuation of this particular corner of cinematic mythology exists because enough individual households, sometime around 2004 and 2005, decided to give a strange, cigar-chomping, cat-loving demon a second chance on their television screens after missing him in theaters. It stands as a small but genuine testament to how much cultural and commercial power ordinary audiences, rather than box office charts alone, once held over which stories got to continue. Finally, it is worth situating Hellboy within the broader arc of American attitudes toward religious and demonic imagery in popular entertainment during this specific period. The early 2000s sat within a cultural landscape still processing decades of periodic moral panic around horror media, stretching back through the satanic panic anxieties of the 1980s and continuing into ongoing, if somewhat diminished, religious sensitivity around any mainstream entertainment product that put words like hell, demon, or devil front and center in its marketing. The specific pockets of resistance Hellboy encountered, the retailers who declined to stock merchandise, the regional theaters and markets uncomfortable with the unaltered title, reflect a real and specific tension point in American popular culture at that moment. One where a film could simultaneously earn strong reviews from mainstream critics and still trigger organized discomfort from more conservative corners of the same audience it was trying to reach. What makes this particularly interesting from a cultural analysis standpoint is how thoroughly the film's actual content undercuts that discomfort once audiences actually watched it. Hellboy is, at its emotional core, an unmistakably moral story about choosing goodness over destiny, about found family triumphing over biological origin, and about the very Christian-adjacent idea that a soul is defined by its choices rather than by the circumstances of its birth. Del Toro, drawing directly on his own Catholic upbringing, filled the film with visual and thematic touches that reward viewers looking for religious symbolism, from Professor Bruttenholm's rosary playing a pivotal role in the film's climax, physically interrupting Hellboy's path toward apocalyptic destiny, to the broader narrative arc that essentially retells a very old story about free will overcoming predestination. In hindsight, the controversy the film generated upon release looks almost like a case of surface-level imagery triggering a reaction that the film's actual substance never really earned, and that gap between perception and content is itself a small, telling cultural artifact of exactly how anxious certain parts of American popular culture still were, even in 2004. About any entertainment product willing to put a demon on the poster, regardless of what that demon actually stood for once the lights went down and the story began to unfold on screen. Taken together, the historical Nazi occultism, the resurrected and reimagined Rasputin, the deep well of Lovecraftian cosmic horror and Kirby-inspired comic artistry, the Slavic and Gothic folklore, Del Toro's Catholic and Mexican cultural imagination, and the very real religious anxieties the film stirred up upon release all combined to make Hellboy one of the most culturally and historically layered comic book films of its entire era, a movie that rewards exactly the kind of close, patient attention we have given it today. If digging into the real history and mythology hiding beneath the surface of this film gave you a new appreciation for what Del Toro and Mignola built together, do the channel a favor and hit that like button. Share this video with anyone who loves peeling back the layers behind their favorite movies, and subscribe so you never miss the next deep dive into the stories behind the stories you love.